Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
We wanted to address this enormous topic that we've been talking about, bringing up on the podcast for a while, and we just decided to go for it this week. We're going to be talking about death. This is obviously an enormous topic. We've given some thought to trying to make it a little more specific, but it's not really yielding to us as is fitting. And so we're aware we're stepping into some very, very big territory. We're all feeling somewhat inadequate to the task, but we're going to launch in and see how we do today with an eye toward exploring what Jung thought about death and perhaps exploring a little bit what dreams have to say about death. And so with that as an introduction, let's set off into this very mysterious territory.
There is a fairly long chapter in Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Life After Death. That's the title of the chapter. I've read it before. I've read it again yesterday and went back to it. Jung really speculates on what might be, and gives some credence to the speculations that we're all, I think, familiar with from many a religious tradition. He gives credence to the primacy of psychic reality and how we experience those psychic realities through our dreams and other kinds of experiences. And I found that an interesting and important kind of nodal point, that there is a liminal space, perhaps a transcendent space, that has a reality of its own. And we are given intimations of this in life.
Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a close collaborator of Jung's, has a book called On Dreams and Death. And in it, she uses dreams to explore what we might be able to discern about the persistence of some kind of existence, I suppose, after the death of the body. And she very much digs into what Jung thought about this and kind of picks up on what you were talking about, Deb. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that Jung and von Franz seem to believe that at the time of death, there might be sort of a slow, gradual disconnection of the person who's passed on from the body so that they sort of hang around for a little bit. Here's this dream that von Franz had after the death of her father. This dream took place about 3 weeks after the death of her father, and it's wonderful because we have this dream, what she thinks about it, and then she also reports to us what Jung thought about it. So here's her dream. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening, dark outside. I heard the doorbell ring and knew at once somehow that this was my father coming. I opened the door, and there he stood with a suitcase. I remembered from the Tibetan Book of the Dead that people who died suddenly should be told that they are dead. But before I could say so, he smiled at me and said, "Of course I know that I am dead, but may I not visit you?" I said, "Of course, come in," and then asked, "How are you now? What are you doing? Are you happy?" He answered, "Let me remember what you, the living, call happy. Yes, in your language, I am happy. I am in Vienna, his hometown, which he loved and longed for all his life, and I am studying at the music academy." Then he went into the house, and we climbed the stairs, and I wanted to lead him to his former bedroom. But he said, "Oh no, now I am only a guest," and went up to the guest room. There he put his suitcase down and said, "It is not good for either the dead or the living to be together too long. Leave me now. Good night." And with a gesture, he signaled me not to embrace him, but to go. I went into my room thinking that I had forgotten to put out the electric stove and that there was a danger of fire. At that moment, I woke up feeling terribly hot and sweaty. So then she tells us that Jung interpreted this dream on the objective level. That is, he saw it as a dream concerning her father. And he said that her father was in Vienna, which was, much beloved, that he had kind of gone home. And of course, we do think about death often as a return to home. So von Franz further says that her father had been musical, but had never really developed his musical talent. And so in the afterlife, somehow he's catching up on something that he neglected during his physical life. But she draws special attention, and I would agree with her here, that the conversation that they had about happiness is really important. So his view about what happiness is, now that he's passed over, is very different from what we might understand it on this side of the veil, so to speak. Feelings are so different after death that we can scarcely express them any longer in the language of the living. That's what von Franz writes.
Jung also had experiences of a mysterious nature subsequent to his heart attack, which was almost fatal. And he writes, a bit about what he perceived when he was, as he says, beyond the veil, and writing a letter to Christine Mann, who was also a collaborator and a student of his. And he writes to her, "As you know, the angel of death has struck me down too, and almost succeeded in wiping me off the slate. I have been practically an invalid ever since. Fortunately, my head has not suffered." And then he says, "On the whole, my illness proved to be a most valuable experience, which gave me the inestimable opportunity of a glimpse behind the veil. When you can give up the crazy will to live, and when you seemingly fall into a bottomless mist, then truly real life begins with everything you were meant to be and never reached. It is something ineffably grand. I was free, completely free and whole as I never felt before." And he goes on to describe a vision of being above the earth, seeing an opalescent globe off the tip of India, a temple on a rock. Now, we could, make of this what we might make of any dream. Is it purely fantasy? Is it some kind of a delusion? And is it psychic life, which has its own realm and has its own validity, reality, and truth? And very often we experience something very like this in our dreams or in other altered states of consciousness. And we often wake up from a dream, and as Jung is relating this experience of, it was real. It's just not real in our grounded, earthly, bodily, conscious dominated way of being in the world most of the time.
Jung's near-death experience is really, really well documented, and he has written about it also in his memoir. And it has many qualities in common with the near-death experiences of other people. Now we have a pretty rich literature about near-death experiences, and of course there are many hypotheses, and you shared some of them, Deb, about what they might be. Jung certainly treated it as if it were psychic reality, as if it was a real experience and not simply sort of the delusion of a oxygen-starved brain or something. We don't really know. It's my understanding that there's some pretty interesting stuff that comes out when you really dig into NDEs, but that's almost sort of a separate episode.
I think that for most of us, death is a concept. Even when we are in the presence of death, there's a way in which what we are experiencing through our senses is still being organized by the archetype of death and our relationship to that. We don't follow the departed out of their body and into these secret realms, if they exist. We know only what we're experiencing in the moment and our reactions to that. I think that Jung, as a phenomenologist, was interested in what could be experienced and therefore reflected on, although he did not discount things that were just out of his purview. So Jung noticed that people's dreams, even a year before death, for instance, would begin to change, would begin to comment differently in preparation for this separation from the physical body, which gave him the sense that there was something natural about death and that the psyche was keenly aware of the degradation of the physical vehicle and was preparing to set that aside. His role as a psychopomp was to tend that emerging reality and to facilitate as much growth as is possible before the body passes away. He was clear that fearing death or being over-focused on it seemed to inhibit people and push them into the wrong direction. He felt that death should be viewed as the goal or as the finishing line of a life well lived, which then brings up the question, what is a life well lived? Jung, of course, was interested in how well we have incarnated the self. How has the ego learned to be receptive to what its mission in this life has been? He also infers, not so much in his comments around death and dying, but more in the relationship between the ego and the self, that the self, which is eternal, requires the experience of the ego in order to continue to evolve on its own terms. And what we might be able to extrapolate from that is that our experiences live on in the, so to speak, memory of something greater than ourselves. And sometimes that greater being is thought of as a kind of rhizome out of which the ego has emerged. Sometimes the greater being is synonymous with the God image. And Jung was very interested in the evolution of the God image over eons of time, such that he could comment on through anthropology. But I think he was inferring and intuiting and perhaps even experiencing in ways that we don't understand that our experiences lived on in a consciousness greater than the ego, and that we could take some comfort in that, and beyond that, perhaps even understand that that is a mission for a given incarnation, to enrich this greater level of being that Jung could only infer about.
Joseph, I just want to sort of add to what you're saying, and this really important idea that somehow the goal has something to do of the relationship between the ego and the self. And in her book, Marie-Louise von Franz really agrees with you right there. She brings in all these dreams that people had shortly before their death. And many have these rather terrifying images of the beyond, something really kind of dreadful and oppressive. But other dreams present very comforting images. And in her estimation, the difference has to do with how psychologically mature the person is and whether or not the person had forged a relationship with the self.
So this really underscores how for Jung von Franz and in many a tradition, how important it is that we develop a relationship to the infinite, which Jung said was the great question of life. In other words, how we can transcend or reach beyond ego to the something greater, to the unknown, to a mystery. And that then death is the goal in the sense of completion of life. And if we see our lives in the context of its finitude, I think that really reframes, reshapes what we deem important about our daily lives. It really puts it into a different context.
I'd like to just share a quote of Jung's, and this is from the collected works 8, and he has an essay called The Soul and Death. He writes, "In my rather long psychological experiences, I have observed a great many people whose unconscious psychic activity I was able to follow into the immediate presence of death. As a rule, the approaching end was indicated by those symbols which, in normal life, also proclaim changes of psychological condition. Rebirth symbols, such as changes of locality, journeys, and the like. I have frequently been able to trace back, for over a year in the dream series, the indications of approaching death, even in cases where such thoughts were not prompted by the outward situation. Death, therefore, has its onset long before death. Moreover, this often shows itself in peculiar changes of personality which may precede death by quite a long time. On the whole, I was astonished to see how little ado the unconscious psyche makes of death. It would seem as though death were relatively unimportant, or perhaps our psyche does not bother about what happens to the individual. But it seems that the unconscious is all the more interested in how one dies, that is, whether the attitude of consciousness is adjusted to dying or not."
Yeah, I've always loved that quote, Joseph, and I'm really glad you shared it, because Jung seems to be saying that, judging from what he sees, the unconscious is not too worried about death. It's not really that big a deal, which I find really interesting and kind of comforting.
I found in that quote, as I had said a few minutes ago, that the unconscious is keenly aware of approaching death long before we become symptomatic, long before there's a disease process that is known or discovered, but that the unconscious, which is connected to our bodies at every level, perhaps even connected to all points in space in a way that we don't quite understand, is keenly aware of this unfolding process, not only in us, but in the collective as well, that at the depths, the unconscious is co-participating in thousands and thousands and thousands of moments of death, and that tending that natural process is so intrinsic to the fundamental nature of reality that it takes effort on the part of the human ego to fight against it. In our natural state, the beginning, the flourishing, the end, and the termination of life are the most natural things, the simplest thing. When I reflect on my own experiences of being with the dying, both personally and then also professionally, when I used to work as a medical social worker in a level 4 trauma service, and I was the social worker for the burn trauma unit, and for the neurologic intensive care unit. So I was in a situation frequently where the family was being informed that the individual had passed or was passing, or I was in the room when that occurred. And there was an extraordinary spectrum of ways that people had or had not developed a relationship with the archetype of death. For the most part, I think in American culture, this is just an anecdotal observation, it seems that we are so defended against death, against the certitude of death, that we are so frightened by the cessation of life, that we are often so philosophically unprepared to imagine who we would need to be in order to gracefully slip into the hands of the Death Mother when the time is just right, when we would welcome the mercy of being liberated from our suffering, that we make it more difficult, more painful, more frightening, more alien than perhaps it would need to be. And certainly, we deprive ourselves of the kind of elegant religious aesthetic that many more ancient cultures have been able to cultivate, in part because lacking the technology that we have in the modern age, we could not forestall death in the ancient world, and therefore developing an attitude of acceptance was essential. But also, it seems that death was considered an intrinsic and essential part of life. One of the religious shaping around death was the certitude that the ancestors continued to be in intimate relationship with their progeny, facilitating, protecting, helping, nurturing. And I think that the way that we have adopted a scientific attitude in the modern era has deprived us of some of the essential aesthetic that the ancient world had around death. It's given us a great amount of benefits to embrace, of course, science and scientific attitude. But I think facing these existential realities like death, we have actually been deprived of a kind of help that we might have had.
You know, I like what you've just touched on, Joseph. It's really, I think, profound. That about our attitude toward death. And in ancient times when death was so ever present for all kinds of reasons, disease and childbearing and everything else, it may have been easier to have a more accepting attitude toward death, whereas now we are threatened by it, we're frightened by it. And Jung has a lot to say about this from the perspective of how we insist on consciousness as the sole kind of reality for what is real, that we insist on cognition, we insist on science. By its very nature, something like death is beyond our ability to just think it through or cognize it. And that this is where other realities, the realities of the unconscious, can come into play, that where we turn to mythology, we turn to images from religion, we turn to dreams, we turn to psychic life. But in our modern day world, where we're tend to be so concrete and so insistent on consciousness as the arbiter of reality, it makes something like death very foreign and, as you said, alien.
Yeah, I agree that that's a really great point, Joseph. And I want to share one of my favorite Marion Woodman quotes that I think supports what you're saying. She says, without an understanding of myth, without an understanding of the relationship between destruction and creation, death and rebirth, the individual suffers the mysteries of life as meaningless mayhem alone. And I think it's getting at just what you're saying, that when we're allowed to have a philosophy or a mythology or a kind of cosmic outlook that helps us contextualize these great mysteries of life and death, then we can face them differently than when we're deprived of that. There's actually this really remarkable dream in the von Franz book that I'm going to put my hands on here, where she talks about when we're deprived of a kind of transpersonal standpoint, it's like we're trapped and there's no way to go and we can't get out. This is a dream that a dreamer had who she had a very kind of scientific, materialistic, rationalistic attitude toward the world. And here's the dream. I am standing quite confused inside a courtyard. There is no exit. On one side of the yard are garbage men who say that I cannot get out of the yard because it is a machine for demolishing cars. Another man thinks that there is a revolving door through which he could get me out, but I am afraid that it might be a trap. So I remain in the yard and walk in circles along the walls. I behave like the others, like a pedestrian, but inside I am tortured by the fear of not being able to find my home. And it's really such a moving dream that she's bereft and desolate without a transpersonal standpoint. There is the potential of it in this image of the revolving door, but she worries it's a trap. And many times, if we are kind of hyper-rationalistic, we do feel like a more religious or spiritual standpoint might be sort of like snake oil, and we do mistrust it. But in fact, it's not. There is something there. I mean, I think that's very clear from our study of the psyche and from Jung's. And I think that dreams do, in fact, do what you were pointing to earlier, Joseph. Dreams can help prepare the psyche for death, can align us with the need to surrender to this experience in a way that is graceful and welcoming. And we see this in dreams of people who are approaching death, that their psyche is preparing them, but both perhaps even for their own death and sometimes for the death of those close to them.
So I think what we are circumambulating here as a theme is the crucial importance of having some intimation, relationship, and experience of a transpersonal reality, something greater, something more, something deeper than our ego-oriented, usual waking life attitude. And I'd like to bring in another aspect of when this kind of transpersonal attitude is accessed, and it's often accessed spontaneously in response to a sudden real life crisis. Joseph Campbell, in his book The Power of Myth, tells a story about two policemen in Hawaii going over the Pali Pass, which was very, very windy. The two policemen see a man who is beyond the guardrail and about to jump off. And they stop, and the policeman on the right side, passenger side of the car, jumps off and grabs the man. And then he too is in danger. And meanwhile, the second policeman has been able to grab hold of both of them and save them. Later, a newspaper reporter asked the first policeman, "Why didn't you let go? You would have been killed." And his reported answer was, "I couldn't let go. If I'd let that man go, I couldn't have lived another day of my life." So, what Campbell describes this as a breakthrough of a metaphysical realization, which is that you and the other are one. You are two aspects of the one life, and your apparent separateness is but an effect of the way we experience forms under the conditions of space and time. And that is something that Jung refers to again and again, of our space, time, and causality. And yet, under those sudden, unexpected conditions, this policeman, and there are many, many stories of battlefield sacrifices and more, realized that his own life had a boundarylessness. And so he was connected to this man about to jump off the cliff. There are many ways, many pointers, many illustrations of something larger than our own ego-bounded waking life reality.
So we're clearly circumambulating the topic. There's so much that Jung reflected on, let alone the innumerable other philosophers and traditions that comment on it. We've landed on one imperative which is consistent through Jung's work, is that we are in a better place to embrace reality when we face death, face other aspects of reality that cannot be avoided, process the neurotic fears we have around it, and explore ways in which we can take hold of this phenomenon and not only make peace with it, but harness it to a determined vitalization of the time that we are given, to provide a frame of meaning, which is the opposite of the limitlessness of both childhood and narcissism, for that matter. By accepting the kind of Saturnine limits of this incarnation, we create a quality of intensity in our living that allows the soul to be affected by our experiences in such a way that there is a progressive unfoldment of evolution at the level of soul. And this is essential in our task to move towards Jung's idea, at least, of what individuation was, to become our fullest version of ourselves, to have the audacity to incarnate who and what we are meant to be, in order to embrace an act of such absolute defiance. It has to be set against the time limit that we have been given, or else we will forestall who we were meant to be, and it will only live in a kind of provisional fantasy of immortality. And that, frankly, is tragic.
Jung so emphasized the importance of life. And Joseph, you just said that how limitations create an intensity around living. And I might add an intentionality of living. Because Jung thinks our time here on Earth really contributes to an evolution that is really beyond our understanding. And he says, only here in life on Earth, where the opposites clash together, can the general level of consciousness be raised. That seems to be man's metaphysical task, which he cannot accomplish without quote, mythologizing, unquote. Myth is the natural and indispensable intermediate stage between unconscious and conscious cognition. So we have work to do while we're here. How we grow, what we value, how we choose to live our lives matters in some mysterious way in the great cosmic scheme of things.
Following up on that, I have this quote from Jung. He says, "We must give nature a chance to fulfill itself. Then only can we detach, and then it comes about quite naturally. One could say, live your life to the full, and then you can die." This idea was expressed by Cicero, the idea that the fullness of life brings about the fullness of time and the moment which is ripe for death. That was an antique standpoint, and in a way it is true. When nothing remains, it is the end. Everything has been said and done. It is perfectly natural, even logical, that one vanishes. If one has done one's duty, fulfilled one's task, one can then die. One can say goodbye and disappear. I want to bring in a different kind of reference here, which I think expresses the same thing that we've been talking around, and that is the preparedness, the sense that I'm done and I'm okay to move on. And it comes in the form of a song. It's a song called "This Old House," and the person who wrote it is Shakin' Stevens. And if you know the song, it's very upbeat, and when you hear it, you want to get up and dance. But the words say something of a very different kind of a little unexpected, although in a way it makes sense that it's a joyous song. That I'm just going to read the lyrics for the first stanza. "This old house once knew his children. This old house once knew his wife. This old house was home and comfort as they fought the storms of life. This old house once rang with laughter. This old house heard many shouts. Now he trembles in the darkness when the lightning walks about. Ain't gonna need this house no longer. Ain't gonna need this house no more. Ain't got time to fix the shingles. Ain't got time to fix the floor. Ain't got time to oil the hinges, nor to mend no window panes. Ain't gonna need this house no longer. He's getting ready to meet his fate." So there's a celebratory mood to this song that life is done. The house is falling apart. Not going to invest in fixing it. Let's go meet our fate.
Another lens that we might just chat about, because it's central to Jung's work, is the idea of the mortificatio. Later in his life, Jung became interested in alchemical symbolism. This was part of the great rift between him and Toni Wolff, his collaborator. She was essential in helping him develop and find language around his experiences. But when he really was captured by alchemy, she just couldn't relate to it, just didn't think it was going to be helpful to his mission. But Jung was sure that there was a secret in alchemy that was absolutely essential for the next stage of evolution of his ideas and his own personal philosophies, apparently. One of the key aphorisms of alchemy is "Salve et coagula," which we've all heard a bazillion times. But the word salve, to dissolve, is one of the key psychospiritual processes that one must embrace if one is to have an analytic experience. And to dissolve is to allow or facilitate, or at the very least embrace, the process of certain values, attitudes, opinions, images, certitudes, to allow them to die. I think that for many of us, our psychospiritual growth is stymied because we have come up to a kind of threshold, or perhaps even more accurately, we're standing on the edge of a great cliff psychologically. And the self is asking us to cast away the things which no longer work, that we have outgrown, or perhaps are even preventing us from maturing to the next step. And our fear of dissolution can become so great that we fight against the self. We fight against life because we lack a philosophy of dissolution. Jung was so motivated to help us embrace the process of dissolution. He found innumerable numbers of myths and images, dreams, alchemical fantasies, trying to help himself and others understand the absolute necessity for embracing the death of the old.
So psychologically, this takes us into the realm of shadow and those parts of us that have to be embraced, and where we have to allow old attitudes and certitudes to dissolve. So in a way, these are deaths of old ways of being, old attitudes, old ego stances. And we have a lot of practice, if we choose to practice, before our actual physical death, if we're given old age, of allowing other things to dissolve, other things to die, that there might be new life, that we might continue to grow and expand and become more whole.
And of course, that is the central mystery of many a religious tradition.
Yes.
That what awaits us beyond that dissolution is a kind of rebirth and a triumph over death. I mean, that, of course, is embedded in the Christian myth. It also, by the way, was the fundamental mystery at the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries. So these were practiced in great secret. They were one of the primary religious cults in ancient Greece. But we know very, very little about what actually happened because they were supposed to be so secret, so there are no good records left. But what we're pretty sure happened at the height of the ritual was the return of Persephone from the dead. And it was supposed to be just a really impactful moment of her reappearance. And by experiencing this, the initiates themselves would have been initiated into the reality that there is rebirth after death.
This paradigm of birth, death, and resurrection is essential in so many mystery religions. Of course, it's central to the Christian religion. It's present in the myth of Osiris and Dionysus and Attis and Cabell and innumerable examples of that. And it's part of the agricultural cycle that we all have observed for untold eons. I want to swing back to Deb's comment there that shadow work, to really embrace shadow work, is to embrace this dissolving death of the old image of who and what we thought we were. And it is an act of personal crucifixion to do that. So we start by attending to what we find most deplorable in the world and in others. And then Jung promotes a radical step, which is to find the nodal point of reality in ourselves that corresponds to the despicable thing that we are sure is outside of us. We are in a stunning time in the Western world where powerful cultural mechanisms have been set in motion which support us in disavowing enormous aspects of our own nature and allowing us to weaponize our own denial so that we will find targets of people, institutions, religions, any number of things where we will lay parts of our own unacceptable nature and then participate with great fervor in the destruction of the thing we've landed our shadow on and the motivation to annihilate the thing that I have pushed my shadow into has reached a shocking level in our culture. Jung offers us an antidote for that, but it cannot be forced on anyone. The only way out of the place that we are in our culture is to see that the enemy is us. And if we have any hope for transforming this muddy, painful mess that we've all created in our culture, it's in the redemption and the purifying fire that is set in motion when we reclaim our accusations and transform them into statements that declare what I do not want to know about myself.
So in this way, what you're saying relates to our theme today in such an important way that we have to die to old beliefs and old attitudes, projections, the denial of our own shadow. If we can die to that, in a way, we'll be rebirthed into a larger and more whole, more integrated attitude and version of ourselves. In other words, although we tend to think of death as the end of physical life, we have an opportunity to embrace small deaths of old false beliefs or illusions or delusions, projections. We have opportunities to undergo this process all along the way and discover that we are more and our life is more, so that by the time, hopefully, we encounter our physical death, it will not be such a stranger.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. We're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Deb, I want to pick up on what you just said by offering a few dreams that I think can help us see more clearly, perhaps, how the unconscious views death, and perhaps we'll find them comforting. The first dream is very simple. It was a sunny day, and I was carrying a little child dressed in a long white gown to be baptized. The path to the church led up a steep hill, but I was holding the child safely and securely in my arms. All of a sudden, I found myself at the brink of a crevasse. I had just enough time to set the child down on the other side before I plunged into the abyss. This was the dream of Sophie Scholl, who dreamed this the night before her execution. She was in a Nazi jail cell when she had this dream. I think she was 19 or 20 years old. She was very young. And of course, if you don't know her story, she had been protesting against the Nazis and had been tried and found guilty and was to be executed. She woke up in the morning and told her cellmate this dream. And she understood that the child represented their cause and said that their cause was going to prevail, even though she herself would die, which is certainly one way of seeing this dream. But I'd like to offer another way to see it is that the child is the archetypal child, the divine child, that will continue, that some part of us will persist after the death of the physical body. There's also this really remarkable dream by the writer J.B. Priestley, which has somewhat of a similar feel. And it's sometimes referred to as the Tower and the Birds. And Priestley wrote about it in his book On Time. So here's his dream. And he had this dream sometime during the 20th century. I was standing at the top of a very high tower, alone, looking down upon the myriads of birds flying in one direction. Every kind of bird was there, all the birds in the world. It was a noble sight, this vast aerial river of birds. But now, in some mysterious fashion, the gear was changed, and the time speeded up so that I saw generations of birds, watch them break their shells, flutter into life, mate, weaken, falter, and die. Wings grew only to crumble, bodies were sleek, and then in a flash bled and shriveled, and death struck everywhere at every second. What was the use of all this blind struggle towards life, this eager trying of wings, this hurried mating, this flight and surge, all this gigantic, meaningless biological effort? As I stared down, seeming to see every creature's ignoble little history almost at a glance, I felt sick at heart. It would be better if not one of them, if not one of us at all, had been born, if the struggle ceased forever. I stood on my tower, still alone, desperately unhappy. But now the gear was changed again, and time went faster still, and it was rushing by at such a rate that the birds would not show any movement, but were like an enormous plane sown with feathers. But along this plane, flickering through the bodies themselves, there now passed a sort of white flame, trembling, dancing, then hurrying on. As soon as I saw it, I knew this white flame was life itself, the very quintessence of being. And then it came to me in a rocket burst of ecstasy that nothing mattered, nothing could ever matter, because nothing else was real but this quivering and hurrying lambency of beings. Birds, people, or creatures not yet shaped and colored, all were of no account, except so as this flame of life traveled through them. It left nothing to mourn over behind it. What I had thought of as tragedy was mere emptiness or a shadow show, for now all real feeling was caught and purified and danced on ecstatically with the white flame of life. I had never felt before such happiness as I knew at the end of my dream of the tower and the birds.
That's a remarkable vision of despair yielding to joy, yielding to beauty, and yielding to eros, to love. And Jung says in his memoir of all the things that he knew, studied, and understood, he says that he has yet to understand what love is. And yet it seems to me that there it is in that dream, that there is something ecstatic, alive, and eternal.
And if I could, I'm going to just take us out here with two of Jung's dreams that he had at the end of his life. One he had a couple of weeks before he died, and he told it both to Barbara Hannah and to Marie-Louise von Franz. And I think he had it about 2 or 3 weeks before he died. And this was the dream. I saw the other Bollingen, bathed in a glow of light, and a voice told me that it was now completed and ready for habitation. Then far below me, I saw a mother wolverine teaching her child to dive and swim in a stretch of water. So the other Bollingen was ready to receive him. But meanwhile, life continued on. And there was this new learning of diving and swimming. And finally, Jung's very last dream, which was reported by a close family friend, Lawrence Vanderpost. The night before he died, his dream depicted an uprooted tree whose roots were filled with great lumps of gold.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.